we go. Great. Good evening, everyone, as you enter from the waiting room. If you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program titled the Reva and David Logan Collection of Photographic Books, you're in the right place. We're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. So sit back, relax, make yourself comfortable, and just be a little patient. We are going to be starting in just a minute or so. We have quite a few people registered, and we're going to give them time to come in from the waiting room. Thanks.
Oops.
So excited to move the show along, aren't you, Christine?
I know, I made a little preview.
Good evening, everyone. Again, if you've just joined us for the Book Club of California's live online program tonight, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Reva and David Logan collection of photographic books with our good friend, Christine Holt Lewis. We are going to be starting in just a moment or so. We'll let another minute go by so folks can join us from the waiting room. So again, sit back, relax. We will be starting in a second. Thanks. Okay, it's now a few minutes past the top of the hour, so I think we'll get started. Good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled the Reva and David Logan Collection of Photographic Books. Again, it's a live online presentation by Christine Holt Lewis, PhD, curator of the Logan Collection and the interim curator of the Pictorial Collection at the Bancroft Library. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director of the Book Club of California. And it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 120 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening. And they're on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, history, collecting, and much, much more. If you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program title, The Reva and David Logan Collection of Photographic Books. This is, again, a live online presentation by Christine Holt Lewis, PhD, and curator of the Logan Collection, and the interim curator of the Pictorial Collection at the Bancroft Library. So Christine Holt Lewis has been the curator of the Logan Collection since 2014. And she's currently, as I said, the interim curator of the Pictorial Collection at the Bancroft Library. She has a PhD in American Studies with an emphasis in photographic history from Boston University. She co-authored the award-winning study of 19th century landscape photographer Carleton Watkins, titled Carleton Watkins, The Complete Mammoth Photographs from Getty, in 2011. Her most recent publication is an essay on women's photo books in the post-World War II period for What They Saw, Pictorial Photo Books by Women, 1843 to 1999. And that's from 10 by 10 photo books. And that was published in 2021. So that's out now. And we'll give you more information on that later in the program. Christine has taught classes on the history of photography and photo books of the American West at Boston University and at UC Berkeley. At Bancroft, she co-curated several exhibitions at the Bancroft Gallery on California painting, the Logan collection, and Western photographic portraiture. Her most recent exhibition, Uprooted, the Incarceration of Japanese Americans, explores the response to Japanese Americans to their imprisonment during World War II. And that's going to be on view until June 2022. And we're going to give you some information on that later in the program as well. So the Reva and David Logan collection of photographic books at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley is an outstanding collection of roughly 1,500 books and periodicals about photography in all of its forms. Amassed over several decades by philanthropists and art lovers, Reva and David Logan, the collection is particularly strong in fine art photography, documentary photography and photojournalism in the U.S. and in Europe, portraiture, and early photographic manuals. Now, tonight, Christine will provide an overview of this wonderful collection, and she's going to highlight some of her favorites for us. So if you have any questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the chat and the Q&A. Okay, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce Christine Holt-Lewis and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Christine, it is all yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks and welcome everybody who are just joining us from far and near. It's my pleasure tonight to share with you today some of the highlights and shadows of this wonderful collection of photo books. This collection was donated by the Logan Family Foundation to Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley back in 2013. It's thanks to David and Reva Logan that rare and important examples of the history of photography have been preserved and are now available to the wider community. We at Bancroft are especially grateful that the collection ended up at UC Berkeley, a public institution where the books are available to students, scholars, art lovers, photography buffs rather, and nearly anyone, really anyone who's interested in photography. The Bancroft Library is open to the public by appointment, and there will be a link in the chat for the page to the Bancroft Library should you want to come and see some of these books in person. Sorry, there we go. The photo books that comprise this collection were amassed over more than half a century by Reva and David Logan. They were philanthropists who were very interested in funding social justice, investigative journalism, and the arts, with a particular interest in artist books and photo books. The artist books might be familiar to many of you. They are at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco, and there's a dedicated curator there, as well as a dedicated exhibition space for those. Here at Berkeley, we have the photo books, and the gift of books came with funding to support a curator of the collection, which has been me, a biannual symposium on photo books, as well as the remodeling of a seminar room to house the books. So this is something that's really wonderful in Bancroft because most of our books are located downstairs in our stacks and are inaccessible to patrons. But this collection is located primarily in this room, although not all the books have fit in the room, but it's a wonderful seminar room that's climate controlled and has good light controls and everything that we can do to encourage the book's preservation. We regularly host classes in the room. Here's me leading a group of graduate students and some of the great photo books from the collection. And this room is also available for tours, potentially, depending on time commitments. So as we said at the beginning, there are roughly 14 or 1,500 or so photo books on photography and photojournals that comprise the collection. It's particularly strong in 19th century photo books, fine art photography, documentary photography, photojournalism, and portraiture. I'm going to be sharing just some of the collection with you tonight, of course. One of the things that we have from our 19th century collection are these wonderful little books that contain tipped in photographs of from books that aren't, you wouldn't consider them to be photo books per se, but rather the pictures illustrate the poems, as in the case on the left, which is a book of poetry by Thomas Babington Macaulay called The Lays of Ancient Rome, and it's from 1851, and it's got these little albumen prints that are sort of inserted or tipped into the book itself. And Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's novel Hyperion, a romance, which includes photographs by Francis Frith, noted landscape photographer. This was published in 1865, the version that's illustrated here, and it's possibly the first American novel to be illustrated with original photographs. As we mentioned, they also collected a great deal of serials and periodicals, including really well-known ones like U.S. Camera, as well as more smaller runs of periodicals like Minority Photographer's Newsletter or Grain, ones that are more difficult to find. They also collected photographic books on photography. In the early days of photography, photographers learned their trade from experienced photographers and also from articles in photojournals and especially books. And the Logans saw the importance of collecting books about photography and so collected accordingly. These are more interesting for what they reveal about artistic retouching or how to use a camera or the methods of carbon printing and so on. So they were really important ways for early photographers to learn new techniques, hone their skills, think about the enterprise of photography. So what guided the Logans in their collecting, you might wonder? David Logan has said that he, quote, collected what he liked. And this resulted in a collection with great breadth in both canonical and lesser known European and American titles, as well as really deep holdings in certain favorite photographers of his, which include Margaret White, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Robert Frank, and many others. So in the spirit of David Logan collecting what he liked, tonight I'd like to talk about the books that I like, which tend to be books from the 1930s, which is really kind of the beginning of the flowering of photo book publishing in Europe and America. But before I do that, we will look back at a few important photo books from the 19th and early 20th centuries that set up the kind of classic dichotomy that bedevils photography, if you will, for the first 100 or so years of its existence. And that is whether photography is an art or is it simply a document. So we'll look at some of those early books that help illuminate that debate. And then we'll focus again on the 1930s with some of the books that you see here. And then we'll conclude with two of the most significant books of the 20th century by Robert Frank and Henri Cartier-Bresson. So I'd like to start with Julia Margaret Cameron, whose book, Victorian Photographs of Famous Men and Fair Women, was actually published, posthumously, and wasn't published until 1926. This is an edition that was limited to 450 numbered copies, and it was published by Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf for Hogarth Press, a limited signed edition. So the debate over photography status as fine art began in the 19th century and would grow more passionate by the turn of the century. Was a photograph simply a mechanical record or document of a person or scene or an event, or was it an expression of artistry capable of imparting truth and beauty, or could it be both? One of the best known and most influential photographers from that era was Julia Margaret Cameron, whose insightful, penetrating, sort of soft focus expressive portraits were early identified as highly artistic in nature. Cameron didn't take up photography until she was 48 years old, after her children were grown, and she essentially taught herself, learning the art through trial and error. She didn't publish any photo books in her lifetime, but this one was published after her death and exerted a fairly strong influence. It was entitled, as I said, a book of photographs of famous men and fair women. So the beginning of the book features these famous men, including Sir John Herschel, who was often called the father of photography, as he invented hyposulfite, which was an important fixing agent. The person on the right is Julia Jackson, who was her niece and also the mother of Virginia Woolf. So Cameron was not very technically proficient. You can see fingerprints a lot of times in her final prints. The fixing isn't always even. There's all kinds of, things that you might consider mistakes, or what many of her fans consider to be really emphasizing, the nature of her own artistry. It's the hand of the artist in her work. The book, the photographer Peter Henry Emerson from England would be the one to really think about and codify thoughts on how photography could be considered a fine art. This is a wonderful edition from 1886 of his Life and Landscape of the Norfolk Broads, illustrated with 40 beautiful plates from nature, executed in platinotype, which are platinum prints. Emerson chose platinum for its durability and longevity, and also for the really beautiful tonal range that is possible with the platinum process. This was a deluxe edition of 100 copies, although only 25 were actually issued. It's a wonderful and very heavy book. It's a collaboration between Emerson and the writer T.F. Goodall. And it is, in one sense, a exploration of this area of the Norfolk Broads, which was an area of England that was kind of a rural area that was in danger of, whose original folkways were in danger of being lost. So he wanted to sort of document it, but really he's not interested in that as much as he is in promoting the idea of naturalistic photography. So what he meant by naturalistic photography was the idea that the photograph should imitate nature rather than alter it in any way. And so he believed that human vision was such that one would, when you're looking at a subject, the thing that you are looking at, sort of the object of your interest, is in focus, whereas everything else is sort of indistinct and hazy. And so he used a limited depth of field with his lens so that he could replicate that in his photographs. He interestingly, and he also wrote on photography, on writing books on naturalistic photography, and did a number of these wonderful artistic large format books. At the end of, after he had published this book, he smashed the plates that he used to make the prints, which very much ensured the rarity of surviving copies of the book. One recently sold at auction for almost $90,000. On the other side of the argument, even though the people involved weren't necessarily arguing this, but is the sense that photography is best used for documenting things. This is a copy of the book by Thomas Annan, who contributed photographs for the old closes and streets of Glasgow. The first printing, well, there were three printings. There was a printing in 1868 with albumen prints, a printing in 1878 with carbon prints, and that's the picture that I'm showing you on the right is actually from the carbon print edition. And then in 1900, his son Craig Annan printed a copy with photogravures. So the idea of this book was that Annan had been hired by the city of Glasgow to document the buildings, the streets, the alleyways of the city, including the worst slums before they were to be torn down in a 19th century version of urban renewal. What's so interesting about the work is that he often encounters people who kind of amass themselves in the photograph, and he generally let them stay in the frame. And sometimes they appear where you can see their faces pretty clearly. At other times, there's sort of these ghostly, indistinct presences because they were moving, while the lens was engaged. And by including these people, he kind of inadvertently created one of the first social reform documentary books, in that he is making visible the lives of these deeply impoverished people who were not typically the subject of photographic projects. You think back to Julia Margaret Cameron and the famous men and the fair women and so on. But he really approached these people with a respectful and neutral eye and a beautiful sense of composition. And the printing is quite extraordinary too. These carbon prints have a real long-lasting quality, and the blacks in these are just like the most beautiful kind of inky blacks. It's a beautiful book. There were no real captions because this was really kind of a city project to record the city before it was changed. At around the same time, in 1877, the photographer John Thompson collaborated with a journalist to create a series of essays and photographs about street life in London. This was considered rather radical because there was a real interest in promoting the sense, in exposing the lives of the poor. Maybe exposing is not the right word, but in showing the lives of the poor, and in doing so without as much condescension as would sometimes happen by some of their colleagues. There was an increasing interest in urban poverty and in social conditions. And the fact that this book included photographs was a really radical new thing, and it was a real selling point. The authors felt that these images lent real authenticity to the text. And the book is now regarded again as one of the key works in the history of documentary photography. The prints are tipped into the book. They're added in separately. They are of Woodbury types, which is a photomechanical process that ensured, again, that they're made with ink, and they are therefore quite durable, more so than some like albumin prints or salted prints. Because the exposure times were long, the people tend to be in rather wooden and stiff poses, but that didn't detract much from the excitement that was accompanied the publication of the book. So now we're at the turn of the century. We're coming up to 1903, when Alfred Stieglitz would produce this seminal photographic journal called Camera Work. He would be influenced by people like Julia Margaret Cameron and Henry Emerson in his effort to promote photography as a fine art on par with painting or sculpture or any of the other fine arts. Stieglitz did all of the work himself on this wonderful journal. It started in 1903 and it ran until 1917. And we are lucky in the Logan collection to have not one, but two full runs of this wonderful journal, including all of the images. Because the quality of the pictures is so wonderful. Typically, when people get a hold of copies of Camera Work, they cut out these pictures and they sell them on the market, and where they attract and fetch very high prices. And so it's very rare actually to find full editions of the work that includes the photogravures. And that is what these are filled with, are articles and photogravures of photographers that Alfred Stieglitz knew personally, and who he chose as the most likely to help promote the idea of photography being a fine art. So each issue had to be as beautiful as it could be. Each issue featured series of pictures by different photographers. They were given their own page without any text. In fact, the captions were listed at the beginning, and then you would page through the pages to see each of the individual pictures. This is again a portrait of Stieglitz himself. And the idea was that you would really appreciate the artistry of the pictures. In 1903, the inaugural issue featured Gertrude Käsebier, who was a contemporary of Stieglitz. And it's rather, I think, remarkable and wonderful that he chose to highlight the career of a woman photographer at this time when most women were not getting that sort of exposure. So Käsebier was a person who worked in the style of photography, which we now call pictorialism, which was called pictorialism then too, which was the idea that you would use kind of soft focus, romantic subject matter, impressionistic style to produce an image that would be, again, very much like a painting. So the camera is your tool, akin to a brush, like a brush for a painter or a chisel for a sculptor. And she included these pictures of maternity and young youthful beauty. Another early picture from the first issue was Alfred Stieglitz's own picture of the Flatiron Building, which is on the one hand a very urban subject of this building in New York City, but he's rendered it with this wonderful atmospheric effects to be very much more soft and romantic. This pictorialism as the main theme of the magazine would continue for many years, but by the time of the war and about the time that the journal stopped its publication in 1915, he had really started to embrace a different style of photography altogether, which can be described as modernism. So the modernism starts in like the teens and would run through much of the 20th century. Unlike pictorialism, modernism is much more sharply focused. It's typically has higher contrast between the blacks and the whites. I'm not quite the same, interested in the same subtlety of tone, more interested in using the camera, the mechanics of the camera to create the art, and not trying to make it look like something else, but embracing the technology of the camera and of the photographic print. So this again was an incredibly influential photojournal that would influence photographers for generations to come. And the movement of pictorialism would still kind of have a few adherents by the 1930s, but otherwise most photographers had really embraced the tenets of modernism, and as we will see. So now we're moving into the 1930s, which is the time frame that I wanted to kind of focus on as a period of time that I think is really quite wonderful. So this is a book by photographer Doris Allman with text by Julia Peterkin. The book is called Roll. Excuse me. The book is called Roll, Jordan, Roll, and this was there were two editions of this. There's the special edition, of which there are 350 copies, which were numbered and signed by the two contributors. And it's printed in letterpress with copperplate photogravures. Photogravures by the 1930s was really kind of an old-fashioned technology, if you will. Not too many photographers were using it, but it really does give this beautiful tonal range and this beautiful sort of sensibility. So this book came out, and it did so at a very good time for women photographers. I mentioned that Kay Zabir was a woman photographer who was featured in camera work, and not as many women got the chance to sort of hit the big time like that. But Doris Allman was one who did. Like many photographers, she started out as a portraitist and was rather successful. But when the Depression hit, it changed her, as it did many artists in the 1930s, especially in America. And she became more interested in how photography could serve a kind of social purpose. So she was interested, she was a white woman, but she was interested in doing a book on the Negroes of the South. And she met up with this author, Julia Peterkin, who was a Southern white woman who believed that she knew more about Black lives than any other writer. And the result was this collaboration, with Peterkin writing the text and Allman contributing the photogravures. The book describes the religious community of the Gullah people in the coastal areas of South Carolina and Georgia. And while it was appreciated and applauded in its time, even by the NAACP, modern readers object to the book's overly paternalistic writing and portrayal of these Black Southerners, many of them who had been formerly enslaved, as being kind of simple and happy and pre-modern, and other sort of condescending attitudes like that. But Allman's pictures do not participate in that same rhetoric. They don't reinforce the message of the text. They instead provide a sensitive and really nuanced portrayal of the Gullah folk. Here's on the left, we see a picture of the woman ironing, and the other is a baptism scene in a river. And here, I think her early training in portraiture really serves her well. And she gets these beautiful expressions from these people. And while there's an element of romanticization, I think she really conveys the dignity and the beauty of her subjects. And so doing, she affords them a lot more complexity and humanity than the text had done. Allman's book wasn't really intended as any kind of manifesto for social change. It was kind of a description or an account of the Gullah people. But that would be very different from other photo books of the 30s, including Dorothea Lange's American Exodus. This was not published until 1939, but it contained the work that she had done for the previous few years while working for the U.S. government-sponsored Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration. This project, like most documentary projects of the 1930s, was a collaboration. In this case, it was by the photographer Dorothea Lange and her collaborator, Paul Schuster Taylor, who was an economics professor at UC Berkeley, and he would become her husband. Their partnership had a more unified message, than one that Peterkin and Allman had. Here, the subject was the Exodus by American farmers and their families from the Dust Bowls of the southern high plains to California. And the very overt message here was that these people needed government assistance to get back on their feet. So it was very much part of the New Deal project. The book was really careful to balance Lang's images with Paul Schuster's text. So as you can see, I've got an opening of the pages here where the pictures are above and the text is below, but there's really supposed to be a real balance, and that is typical throughout the text, throughout the book. It was really a true merger of empathetic artistic images and more dispassionate statistical text. And it was in that way, it was a real model of engaged social documentary. Here are two more pages from inside the book. And here you can see Lang's real attention to gesture as a way to express the plight of these people. So here are some stricken farmers idle in town during the Great Drought. Just the very fact that they are squatting and seated rather than working sort of tells its own story. And then the other image is entitled Hoe Culture, H-O-E culture. These wonderful gnarled hands clutching the hoe of this farmer, again, telling a lot more through the image than the words alone could do. This book would sell very well and would influence documentary photo books for quite some time to come, especially in its conception of the photo book as resting on what they called a tripod of photographs, of captions, and text, all of these things being given equal weight. Dorothea Lang's colleague in the resettlement administration was Walker Evans, but he was not nearly as interested in promoting social change as he was in exploring exploring America and exploring culture and exploring art through his own sensibility. This book was published in 1938, and it was a carefully prepared letterpress publication originally published by the Museum of Modern Art. And in conjunction with his exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, this was one of the very first solo exhibitions, if not the first solo exhibitions, of a photographer in a major American museum. And Evans spent more time on this book, on sequencing this book, on laying out the pictures, on trying to tell a story about America through his photographs. He spent more time on this book than he did on the exhibition. He was different from Dorothea Lang in whose positivist belief in the objectivity and agency of photography, in that belief that it could change hearts and minds. He didn't quite share that sensibility. So he did, however, share her interest in presenting the people of America, both the rural and the urban. He classically composed his images. Like Dorothea Lang, he used an 8x10 view camera. And he really again focused on the parts of America that maybe hadn't been seen by some of his urban contemporaries. And he really had a kind of a reverence for American culture combined with a sort of sense of irony towards it. So it was a really kind of interesting, visually literate, interesting book. He did this book as a solo project. This was, done on his own terms. There was no collaborator. There was really no text beyond the simple captions. And as you can see from this opening, there's no text next to the photograph. The texts were all in a different part of the book. So you'd have to kind of flip back and forth between the pictures and the captions to sort of see what you were actually looking at. He created a real narrative that evoked the silent poetry of these quintessentially American subjects as automobiles, folk, architecture, billboards, movies. It created a poetic narrative out of the sequencing of images that would be, again, quite influential. And he also had a number of images that sort of focused on the enterprise of photography itself by photographing this great old photo place, this photo booth from somewhere in the heartland. Now, not all of the photo books of the 1930s focused on America and the Depression. Edward Weston published his very first photo book during this time. He published it in 1932 through the publication published by Edward Wahey, and he worked closely with the designer Merle Armitage. Weston, along with his colleague Ansel Adams, was on the West Coast. Most of the other photographers we've seen have so far been rather East Coast based, although Dorothea Lange was also a Californian. They formed kind of the F64 group, was interested in a very pure print. They were interested in portraying nature and people with the most sort of sharply focused images that they could manage. Weston is famous for his concept of pre-visualization, so that he would figure out exactly what the picture should look like, what he wanted it to look like before he pressed the shutter, so that he wouldn't have to do any darkroom manipulations at all, that he could just present the picture. The subject actually would be sort of beautifully presented. But then he did actually spend a fair bit of time in the darkroom, as did Adams, to make sure that the print had as much tonal variety as they could get, with blackest blacks, whitest whites, and kind of a wonderful range of gray tones in between. So this book was kind of, I was going to say revolutionary, but it wasn't exactly revolutionary, but it was brand new in that it was rather oversized. It was very clearly an art book. It has this great spiral binding, which allows you to lay it flat and be able to see the images very, very well. It was printed on a very high gloss paper. The glossy paper was so difficult and slippery to work with for the printers that they couldn't at first get the ink to adhere to the pages until they had this, the story is they had this journeyman printer from Germany who was over, and he threw gasoline onto the printer plates, set it on fire. This was very scary, very odd moment. And then he put out the fire, and the plates were now warm enough to accept the ink, and everything gelled perfectly. So this was a very important thing for Edward Weston, to have prints that looked as good as his actual photographs could look. That was one of his, his must-haves in his very first photo book. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book of these wonderful images. I'm afraid this picture does not do it justice because it's a little bit blurry. You can see the captions are on one side, on the left usually, and then the images on the right. And it was quite a stunning kind of work of art in its own right, which included a number of introductory essays at the very beginning. But the whole idea of this book was to really luxuriate in the pictures. Meanwhile, in Europe in the 1930s, photographers were a bit more experimental in this period. They did not approach the print with the same seriousness as someone like Stieglitz or someone like Weston. They were less interested in portraying objective reality and more interested in sort of visualizing the subconscious, or exploring kind of a hyper objective reality that was made possible only through photography. This book by Man Ray was one of the first books that it was Man Ray's first photo book, and it's entitled Photographs 1920 to 1934 Paris. Man Ray is an interesting figure. He's an American artist, American mostly painter, but who went to Paris in the 1920s and was very influenced by surrealism there, by the Bauhaus movement there. And he was experimenting with photography at the same time. So he experimented with solarization, or that's in photography when you stop the developing process so that light sort of enters and you get this really interesting light look to the picture. Double exposures, as you see in the spread here. The solarization is evident in the portrait of the woman. And this book, again, with this wonderful spiral binding, included essays by fellow surrealists like Marcel Duchamp and Tristan Tzara, and really was an influential book, although it was a very fragile book. The problem with the spiral bindings is that the pages tend to separate from them. And we have to create boxes for anything that we have spiral bindings for in the Logan collection to protect them. But this book, if you can get a wonderful, not too damaged copy of the book, it was recently up for sale for $9,000. So it's gained quite a lot in monetary value. Another wonderful photo book from France in the 1930s is Paris by Night, photographed by Brassai in the book was published in 1934. And it includes these 60 photographs. This is actually very, very different from both the Weston book and the Man Ray book in its scale. So while those books are somewhat oversized, this little Paris by Night book is only 8.5 by 5 inches. So it very much sort of fits into your hand. It was a very unique project. Brassai was one of the very first photographers to engage in a sustained study of photographing the city by night, which created this very familiar landscape that was also very defamiliarized and destabilized because things looked very different. He was working with a smaller camera and faster film so that he didn't use flash much. He mostly used available light, whether it was, light, atmospheric light from the moon or that kind of thing, or from illuminated structures like this. So it's a very small book. It's printed on matte paper, and the inky blacks are so kind of dense on the pages that you can almost feel like they're coming off in your hands. And here the use of that spiral binding not only allows you to lay it flat, but it kind of helps, it creates less of a barrier between the pictures on either side, so that you get like kind of this spread, when it's spread out like this, almost looks like one strange unworldly picture instead of two different pictures side by side. So now I come to the final two books that I wanted to talk about, which are Cartier-Bresson's The Decisive Moment. This was an enormously influential book by this giant of 20th century photography. It was published in 1952, but contained photographs from the 1930s and 40s. The war had delayed its publication, but that was in some ways good for Cartier-Bresson because he could then add more pictures to it. The cover, as you can maybe tell, is by the artist Henry Matisse. And so it really establishes itself as, this is an art book. The cover is a painting by a well-known artist. This sort of whimsical, lovely cover. And I love the cursive writing as well. So Cartier-Bresson is often considered the father of photojournalism because he was one of the first to be on the scene with his 35mm camera and his Rolleiflex camera and capturing scenes of war, as we see here in this picture from Seville, Spain. He would help found the Magnum Photo Agency in 1947 that provide at the time, and still to this day, provides photographs to newspapers and magazines, and employs photojournalists all over the world. So on the one hand, there's that very much kind of documentary and reportage aspect to Cartier-Bresson, but he was also very influenced by the artistic movements around him, by people like Man Ray, people like Brassai, other surrealists, other artists, cubist artists, other artists like Matisse. And so he really uses that artistic sensibility combined with the reportage sensibility, combined with his own sense of humor and humanism to create these wonderful pictures. He's the inventor of the concept of the decisive moment. So he was one of the first to lay out what this meant. It basically refers to a geometry of composition that combines with a story, such that the composition itself helps illuminate and give weight to the story. So what he wrote was, to me, photography is the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event, as well as the precise organization of forms which give that event its proper expression. So a wonderful example of this is this picture of Seville, Spain, where it's a picture of a bombed out building during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. On the one hand, we have all the elements of reportage of you see the rubble, you see the children playing, there's information here and there's evidence here, but there's also great artistry that goes into the way that he has created the composition such that he focuses on the diagonal, the sort of balancing of this group of boys in the lower left with the solo boy in the upper right. The same thing is true on the other side of the picture with this little boy in the lower right, kind of you follow his eye up to the diagonals of these other individual kids. Then your eye goes back to the very back of the picture, sort of this almost perfect center of the picture, but not quite, where there's a lone figure standing at the back. So all of these diagonals kind of contained within the frame of the busted out rubble from the wall. It creates this really wonderful picture that is so much more than just a picture of war. So the book, did I mention its size? It's 14.5 by 10.5 inches. It's a very large book, akin the same size as Life magazine, which was very popular at this time, or a coffee table book. And the size of that matters. It's you really can kind of immerse yourself in the beautiful pages. The images were printed by the famous Draeger brothers in Paris, and they are. It's a beautiful experience to go to page through that book. Here's two images from the coronation of the English King George the Sixth, Queen Elizabeth's father. And here you can kind of see that sort of geometry of the decisive moment playing out in this wonderful kind of triangular composition of these two men hoisting up this older woman. But you can also, there's also just this kind of, it really humanizes the whole experience. We're not looking at the royals themselves. We're looking at the reaction of the people in the crowds, of the ordinary people who need to be hoisted up to see, even though her glasses are rather opaque, at least in the picture. So you're not sure how much she's able to see anyway, or the masses of crowds that gather here on the right. Some of them had waited overnight to see the coronation, but this one man at the bottom just, he couldn't take it anymore, and he fell asleep in the crush of the newspapers below. So there's just, the book is just this wonderful, again, this wonderful sort of mixing of humanity and in some cases horror, or in other cases just history. The captions were all located in a little booklet sort of attached, that was not attached to the book, but a booklet that could be removed from the book so that you could look at the captions and look at the photographs and experience it that way. So it's really, kind of this merger of art and document in this photo book. He would go on to publish many, many more photo books on Moscow and China and other places that he went. And the Logan collection has nearly everything he published. And then the final photographer of this evening, the photo books of this evening are by is the book The Americans by Robert Frank. The Logan collection has two versions. Well, we have multiple versions of the American edition, but we have one version of the French edition, which is on the left. The book was published in 1958, first in France and then in America. The French version was on the one hand very different from the American version, and on the other very much the same. The French version had the exact same pictures in the exact same sequence, but the text was not by Frank or by anyone that Frank chose. It was a series of different essays and quotations by sociologists and people like Alexis de Tocqueville. And it was really, the idea of that book was to explain and elucidate Americans to European audiences. The cover image is by Saul Steinberg, this very kind of whimsical picture. This is a book that Robert Frank was not very happy with. So when he went to Grove Press in the United States to publish it in America, it was published by Delpierre in France, and in America by Grove, he had a lot more say in how he wanted it to look. The decision was to put one of his own photographs on the cover instead of a picture by a different artist. Jack Kerouac, who was as we all know, the beat poet, would contribute the introduction. And then Frank made sure that the sequence of photographs, which he had worked on in the French version, was the exact same in the American version, because like Walker Evans, he sort of had a story to tell in a sense in the pictures. Apart from Kerouac's introduction in the American version, there is no text except for captions. The captions, once again, help you just place yourself in space and time, but otherwise the images are to be understood as sort of visual poetry from Robert Frank. The book did not have a very positive reception when it first came out in the late 1950s. there were two reasons for this. One was that the aesthetic was profoundly different from everything that photographers and the American public were used to seeing. Ansel Adams sort of famously hated the book. They thought that his compositional style was amateurish, and Robert Frank really embraced grain in his books. And so the graininess of the pictures, like you see so well in the picture of the open road here, was really anathema to so many other photographers, and it sort of went nowhere. The other reason that it was criticized was that it was perceived to be critical of America. The book was, titled The Americans, and it was taken, the pictures were taken by a Swiss immigrant, Robert Frank, who had become an American, but he was an outsider. So when his pictures did not kind of correspond to that sort of post-war optimism and America first sort of jingoism, it was perceived as being very critical. It was reissued in 1968, and this time as the counterculture had sort of taken hold and people critiquing American culture and the aesthetic itself of this kind of snapshot aesthetic had also kind of gained a foothold. And so then the book really became a huge seller and very, very influential. And Frank's, his appropriation and use of the American flag, of jukeboxes, of the open road, of the drive-in, these things really, really spoke to a lot of people who were questioning the American dream and the American experience. And in very many ways, he was relying on people that came before him. So like Dorothea Lange, he had a really emotional response to the inequities of American life and culture. And like Walker Evans, he relied on images more than words. So each picture got its own page in the book. The sequence reinforced certain recurring themes and images. The Jack Kerouac introduction is quite wonderful. He calls the book a sad poem right out of America. And the book was at once intuitive, loose, messy, and highly personal exploration of the contradictions of the American dream. And so Cartier-Bresson and Robert Frank are these two very different, European trained artists. One becomes an American, one stays a European. One is very much concerned with formal composition and a decisive moment. The other's much more interested in exploring kind of his own messy psyche and kind of grabbing images, like just sort of putting his arm out the car window and seeing what kind of picture he can take. And both would really cast a very large shadow over the rest of the 20th century. So that concludes my talk this evening. And I'd really like to thank the Logan family for donating this wonderful collection to us at the Bancroft Library. Significantly, the Logans wanted their books to be usable by others. And at his present home at the Bancroft Library, that vision has very much become a reality. And I think we are all the richer for it. And again, these books are available to be seen by the public. So I encourage some of you to come and see them with me. All right, Kevin. So I will open it up for questions.
I'm back. I'm going to actually right now just post the Logan collection overview in the chat for people. I've sent it to a couple people individually, but I'm going to put it up in the chat for everyone to see. You can see that Christina has given more information there on the screen about how to contact her directly. There is the Logan collection link as well. And as we start to wrap up here, before we take some questions, I'm going to ask you to go to the chat and the Q&A now. If you have questions or comments that you want to make, now's the time to put them in there. Some people have sent some directly to me, so we're going to get started with some of those questions. First of all, I'm going to say this was terrific. First of all, hearing about this incredible jewel, this collection, this huge resource that is so close to home, at least for me and for many of the folks here on this the webinar in the Bay Area. This is it's just awesome. I'm definitely going to be following up with you. I already told you about a visit or a tour for myself, and maybe you'll be able to do one for book club members. We could do a Book Club of California member tour of the collection, which I think would be really awesome for folks to see. Yeah. Obvious statement or comment is, what great, beautiful photos you shared. That was just so, it was almost overwhelming. I took so many notes about some of the great photographers and some of those iconic photos. So I'm looking forward to seeing those in person when we can do that. You did say that one of the features of the collection is that you want it to be usable by others, right? You want people to access the collection. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about who is actually coming, maybe pre-pandemic, when they could actually come to see the collection. Who do you host? Who comes to look at the collection there?
Well, there's two ways to access the collection. One is, it used to be that people could just come to Bancroft anytime they wanted and kind of, show their ID and register as a user and come into the door and use our reading room and have these books paged to them to look through. And when that happens, I actually don't know who those people are, because you can just go onto our online catalog and page these books for yourself. As far as who comes, who contacts me and who comes to see them, just to come into the room and kind of get more of a sense of the collection. It starts with students. We've got students at different UC Berkeley classes. Some of them are from like digital photography classes. Some of them are from the journalism school. Some of them are from the art history department. So those kinds of classes. And that's always really great because, the current generation of young people everything is so digital. So it's wonderful for them to see, these actual books in person, the size, the shape, paging through this is the only hard thing about presenting photo books online, is that you can't very easily page through the books. So that's one group that comes, but I've also hosted groups from the Legion of Honor. I have hosted groups from, there's a Logan symposium on photo books every other year at UC Berkeley. And so sometimes people from there will ask to come and have a tour. Also people from the Logan Foundation, they'll say, hey, can we see those books that we used to see back when they were in Chicago and now they're here. So, it's a range of different people and groups. And, unfortunately we were closed for a year and a half or so, but now we are back open by appointment.
So how did the collection end up here in California from Chicago-based philanthropists and art lovers?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the Logans, Reva and David Logan, have 3 sons, and the youngest son, Jonathan, came out to California years ago. And so I'm not sure if it was the 80s or the 90s, and he was very instrumental as the youngest kid. He accompanied his parents on their trips where they would, add to the collection. He relates stories of, being told to go up into the attic at this bookstore and sort of search around for what he could find. So he feels a real sense of kinship, I think, and ownership of the collection, in that sense of being someone who helped create it in some ways. So he was based in California and based in Berkeley. And so the elder Logans, David and Reva, would come and visit him. They formed a relationship with people at the Legion of Honor, who ended up again taking the artist books. There's an absolutely stunning collection of artist books that they collected, which I encourage those of you who haven't been to the Legion to see those, because there's always exhibitions on them in a dedicated space. There was a lot of negotiations and back and forth between David Logan and UC Berkeley. David Logan was a shrewd negotiator and he had a very specific vision for what he wanted these photos to, where he wanted these photo books to go. At first, he approached the art history library at UC Berkeley. We have at least 23 to 25. I'm always losing count of how many libraries we have on campus at Berkeley. And the art history classics library was maybe a natural fit, but they felt that they didn't want to, that they weren't really equipped to deal with all the rarities that were part of it. It's a much smaller space. In Bancroft Library, that's what we do, is that we are the curator, we are the special collections library. So it seemed more of a fit. So so UC Berkeley has this great relationship with John Logan, the youngest Logan, son again. And so these books came here, and they have funded the Center for Investigative Journalism at UC Berkeley, and a professor of journalism, Ken Light, at UC Berkeley, and he was very instrumental too. Ken Light is a photojournalist. He's actually just got the Guggenheim. He's a great photographer at UC Berkeley, and he helped bring this collection in, as did Peter Hanf. Peter Hanf was the deputy director of the Bancroft Library for a very long time, and he just recently retired, which is a real loss for us, because he had such a such a great institutional memory and was such a great contributor for so long. But he helped also bring the collection to UC to Bancroft by forming a relationship with David and Reva Logan.
And as you know, he is here on this call today.
Yes.
Hey, Peter. I know the answer to this because we talked a little bit about this already, but it was in the chat. So I'll ask the question again. Is the collection digitized?
No. Next question. No, I'm sorry. It's the Bancroft Library. We have, oh boy, just in the pictorial collection, we have over 10 million items. And in the manuscript collection and the rare books, it's, tens of millions more items. We have, maybe not tens of millions, but millions more items. And so we have we don't have quite the budget to digitize everything that we would like to digitize. So various manuscripts have been digitized and various photographs, but these books, it's going to be a complicated endeavor because they're all different sizes and they have to be handled with great care because a lot of them are, these first editions from the 19th and early 20th century. And even the late 20th century is starting to, recede further and further into history. So I'm not sure when it will happen. Hopefully it will happen eventually, but we have so much that we'd also like to digitize at Bancroft that it might be a while.
Okay, so we're at the top of the hour, but there's a bunch of questions that I want to get out there for you.
Okay.
One question which I was thinking about as well. Susan asks, is the collection growing? Can people add to the collection, or are you acquiring more items?
Yeah. So part of the gift of the books came with money, as I said, for the seminar room and for the curator position. And we do add to the collection as well. We add both we try and build on some of David and Logan's original vision, as well as we bring in other photo books. We also have other collections of photo books at Bancroft. So Ursula Gropper had a collection of photo books that she donated to the Bancroft several years ago. We at Bancroft specialize in the history of Western America and Western Americana. And so we already also had books by Ansel Adams and Eadweard Weston and Dorothea Lange and all of the sort of Western photographers. But yes, we are still building on it, which is kind of wonderful.
So there's an interesting question about photography books or photo books in general. And the first part of the question is, who was actually buying these photo books when they came out back in the 30s or in the 50s? Who was the customer? Was it the general public? Was it institutions, art collectors?
Yeah, well, that is something that I don't have, an exact answer for, but from my reading and research, it seems as though, like when you take camera work, for example, the journal camera work, most of the audience purchasing that were fellow artists and photographers. Eventually institutions got a hold of it, and Stieglitz tried to place different copies of it with different institutions, but typically it was kind of more the art crowd, art lovers and that kind of thing. I think the same thing is true with a lot of these the higher end limited edition photo books tend to be purchased by photographers, photography buffs, art lovers, but the trade books can have mass appeal. And so that's the story of the Americans is so kind of interesting in that respect, right? So that when it first appears, and it's a trade book, it's not a special limited edition or anything. It's just not popular. And then the culture changes, and then the book, starts to sell. I don't think it's some incredible bestseller, but it's just very, very influential. American Exodus is one of those books, I think, that was also purchased by Dorothea Lange, was purchased by a lot more people because of its historical and cultural resonance, as opposed to sort of the more art. And then, but it's interesting because people like Ansel Adams and Eadweard Weston start to gain, and Cartier-Bresson to a certain extent, they start to gain cultural, people sort of know who they are, who don't necessarily know photographers' names or artists' names. Right. And so kind of gradually those books become more and more popular.
What about the future of photography books? A question that are photography books in decline in current American book
No,
publishing?
no, not at all. I think photography books, it's interesting. There's a robust,
Mm.
there's a robust photography book culture. 10 by 10 photo books is a organization in New York, and they regularly feature salons by people who are creating photo books now, you know, young, well, not just young and old people who are creating photo books now. They're often, you know, the sort of do-it-yourself ability that people have to create their own photo books has really resulted in, you know, this kind of explosion. I think that photo books are more popular than ever, and more ubiquitous than ever, because photo books are just a great way for photographers to share their work. It ensures kind of a real longevity of their work, because a book is going to last. Well, a book can be portable. It can be produced in numbers. It can be purchased by people. I mean, it's the kind of thing that it can really get your name out there in a way, and it can get your vision can be out there in a way that exhibitions just can't really replicate, and even exhibition catalogs don't replicate kind of the vision that someone's photo book. And people are very interested in, you know, in the sequencing of their photo books, and in all of the sort of printing details. So I'd say there's a real renaissance of photo book publishing.
Yeah.
So 10 by 10 photo books features these in New York, and they're just one example. And then this book has recently come out, and I've got an essay in this book on, as you mentioned at the top of the hour, and we just found out that we won the Paris Photo Aperture Foundation Award. That just happened. So I'm only a small part of this book, but I'm going to take pride in the fact that we just won that.
And for those of you who just want to click through, I put it in the chat, the link for that, so you don't have to.
That is a great site for people who are publishing photo books right now. It's great.
So the second part of the question about publishing photo books and the history of the photo book. So you answered it, thrive. The question was, are they in decline or thriving? And you think there's like a renaissance and it's thriving. Was there a publisher, I think you mentioned like Grove and a couple of other publishers who kind of led the charge for publishing photo books back then? Were there publishers who just focused on photo books, or were other people, just all different publishers, doing it?
Yeah, there are a number of different publishers, and that's something that I wish I knew more about, that I kind of wish I paid closer attention to who the publishers were. But yeah, Grove is someone, Aperture is someone who's done a lot of photo book publishing, Grove. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really, it's one of those questions that I don't really know the answer to. But.
That's okay. Sometimes we don't know all the answers. Someone will want to do some research on it. There's an interesting question in here about your cataloging efforts, and it's probably from a librarian. Are you enhancing your cataloging records so that books containing real photo plates or tipped in photos are identified as such, as opposed to just, you know, photo illustration in the catalog?
Yes, yeah, we have a wonderful team of catalogers, special collections catalogers at Bancroft, and they went through this collection they prioritized it when it first came in because we wanted to get an exhibition out. But yes, all of the records should have that available, and the way to look up the collection is we've just changed from our old online system to a new online system called UC Library Search. But if you go to the Bancroft's homepage, I think you can access the UC Search function, and then you can do different searches and find a lot of that information. So it varies. Not every book in the collection is really completely described, but quite a few are, and definitely the ones that have the books that are tipped, the photos that are tipped in are described as.
And I put the link to the Bancroft Library in the chat as well. Got lots of links there for you. Make sure you copy them over to your desktop. Because that question also talked about the photographic processes. Is that cataloged as well? I have a page of notes here on all the photographic processes you mentioned, and I would love to hear more about that.
That part I don't know if it's in every catalog record. That level of detail might not be in all of the records. But it might be. I mean, I think it sometimes is. And generally the processes kind of follow chronologically. So, the books that have albumin prints are going to be books from the 1850s and 60s, because that's when albumin prints were kind of in their heyday. And then later and into the 70s a little bit. And then, there was just so much great experimentation with photographic processes in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. So yeah, you have books with carbon prints, you have these Woodbury types, we have photomechanical processes, and then we have books that have the original pictures tipped in. And then eventually, the halftone process gets more sophisticated, and so by the 20th century you just have less and less, which is interesting that Edward Weston didn't really want a photo book until he could be ensured that the quality of his prints could look just as good, and this is why that glossy paper was chosen, and so on and so forth, because he just didn't like the sort of the halftone reproductions that he saw in so many other photo books.
Yeah, there's some kind of specific questions in the chat and the Q&A, which I'm going to follow up with you after tonight's talk. Maybe you can help answer some of those, and I can get back to some of
I can email some folks.
Yeah, because they're kind of specific, and I don't know if you know kind of off the top of your heads some of these answers. There is a very interesting question which I'm curious about. It asks, is the Man Ray book the very first edition or the common second edition, which was identical? I think you know where he's going with this.
I'd have to look at our catalog record on that. I think it's that more common second edition.
Yeah,
I think so.
That was a great question. I had to get it out there and ask. And there's also a fun question about, do guests have to wear white gloves if they come to the Logan collection to look at books with you?
Really good question. And the answer is yes and no, because if we are looking primarily at books with tipped in photographs, then we wear gloves, because with photographs, we need to be really careful about fingerprints and finger oils. With books, gloves are not recommended. With books that don't have, actual photo prints, because the fibers of the cotton, for example, can just, they sort of get in the way. So as long as you have clean, dry hands, most of the photo books can be used with your bare, clean, dry hands, but some of the other photo books that have photographs, we do require gloves, which we provide. You don't have to bring your own.
Good answer. Good question and good answer. There's two other fun questions before I wrap up that I have to ask. One is about you and how you got interested, like what attracted you or drew you to all of the photo books in as part of your career and your focus.
Well, I got my PhD is in American Studies with an emphasis on photo history. And so my original interest was in actually Western photography, was in landscape photography by Carlton Watkins in particular, but also other 19th century landscape photographers. And then honestly, this position came up. This collection had been donated to the Bancroft Library. And I was also very interested in 1930s photo culture. So I was a big fan and had done some work on Dorothea Lange. And so this position came up, and I thought, what a wonderful chance to use my existing knowledge of 19th century photo photography and processes, and then bring in my early 20th century sort of somewhat expertise, and then learn so much more. I mean, I've learned an absolute ton working with this collection. So that's what's really fun, is that some of the photographers in the collection were very not really known to me, even though I, had taken many classes on photo history and had taught some classes on the history of photography. So that part of it was really great. And I really like the kind of democracy of photo books that you don't have to, go to a museum and see the show and then the show's taken down. Like these have longevity. These have a kind of permanence. Which I think is important.
So this second part of the question, kind of more about you, is your role as the interim pictorial curator right?
Yeah,
For the Bancroft.
so the Bancroft Library has an absolutely outstanding collection of pictorial material. We are probably second in size to the Library of Congress in terms of the number of pictorial items we have. And I had thrown out that number, 10 million pictorial items. That includes negatives. That's not 10 million individual prints. But we have some paintings and prints, but we also have just this enormous photography collection. And so I had been working with Jack Van Oy, who was the previous pictorial curator at the Bancroft. He'd been there for 25 plus years and really built up the collection at the Bancroft to not only focus on historic photographs, meaning 19th century and early 20th, but to take our mission, our mandate to study the culture of the American West up into kind of the present time. So he really had been instrumental in bringing in archives of documentary photographers who worked in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and bring in collections from Native Americans and African Americans and other communities that had been historically underrepresented. So he just retired in this last June, at the same time that Peter left, and our former director Elaine. It was a kind of a mass exodus of talent and expertise. And so I was asked to be the interim curator. I would like it to be a permanent position at some point once we get to that point. But it's a tremendously amazing resource. And the longer I'm there, the more I realize I still don't know. It's just never ending. So yeah, so now I'm kind of wearing two hats, but the photo book collection is part of the pictorial collection and also kind of part of the rare books collection. We have several different curatorial groups at Bancroft.
Well, now we're over time. It's 6:17. Yeah. So there's some great accolades and comments in the chat, which I'll share with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look, so thank you, everybody.
A lot of great positive feedback there. And I'll just say, as we wrap up here, thank you so much for sharing the Logan collection with us. Again, it's right here for those of us in the Bay Area. And I really want to thank you for highlighting the women who were or are the key figures in the collection there. I appreciate your framing of the whole talk about photography as art versus documentation, and the difference and where those overlaps are and where they kind of break away and what that argument is. So that was really fascinating as well. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. It's so kind of, I'm sorry I can't see everybody. I'm sorry I can't respond to all the questions, but you know where to find me, so feel free to email me.
And we will email out the links that we put in the chat to everyone tomorrow after this webinar. So don't feel like if you miss something that you're not going to be able to find it later on. We will send that out to everyone. So again, Christine, thank you so much.
Thank you
for being with us tonight. Thank you everyone for attending this Book Club of California program. Please join us for our next online program titled Your Collection, Deaccessioning Strategies, on Monday, November 22nd here at 5 p.m. That's a week from tonight. This is going to be a live online presentation by Spencer Stewart, and it is the third talk in our series on book collecting and for book collectors. So you can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you might be receiving from the book club. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Christine. We'll be in touch, and we'll put together that book club members tour to come see the Logan collection in the near future.
You're very welcome. Yes, thank you, everybody.
Yep. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. Good night.